Before and during World War II, the Empire of Japan committed numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity across various Asian Pacific nations, notably during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. These incidents have been referred to as the Asian Holocaust, 5-6, and Japan's Holocaust, 7, and also as the Rape of Asia, 8. The crimes occurred during the early part of the Showa era. The Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, were responsible for war crimes leading to millions of deaths, ranging from sexual slavery and massacres to human experimentation, torture, starvation, and forced labor. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Evidence of these crimes, including oral testimonies and written records such as diaries and war journals, has been provided by Japanese veterans. 15. The Japanese political and military leadership knew of its military's crimes, yet continued to allow it and even support it, with the majority of Japanese troops stationed in Asia either taking part in or supporting the killings. 16. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service participated in chemical and biological attacks on civilians during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, violating international agreements that Japan had previously signed, including the Hague Conventions, which prohibited the use of poison or poisoned weapons in warfare. 1718. Since the 1950s, numerous apologies for the war crimes have been issued by senior Japanese government officials. However, apologies issued by Japanese officials have been criticized by some as insincere. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has acknowledged the country's role in causing tremendous damage and suffering before and during World War II, particularly the massacre and rape of civilians in Nanjing by the IJA. 19. However, the issue remains controversial, with some members of the Japanese government, including former Prime Ministers Junichiro Koizumi and Shinzo Abe, having paid respects at the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors all Japanese war dead, including convicted class of war criminals. Furthermore, some Japanese history textbooks provide only brief references to the war crimes. 20. And certain members of the Liberal Democratic Party have denied some of the atrocities, such as the government's involvement in abducting women to serve as comfort women, a euphemism for sex slaves. 21-22. Definitions. Main article: Definitions of Japanese war crimes. The Tokyo Charter defines war crimes as violations of the laws or customs of war. 23. Which involves acts using prohibited weapons, violating battlefield norms while engaging in combat with the enemy combatants, or against protected persons. 24. Including enemy civilians and citizens and property of neutral states, as in the case of the attack on Pearl Harbor. 25. Military personnel from the Empire of Japan have been convicted of committing many such acts during the period of Japanese imperialism from the late 19th to mid-20th centuries. Japanese military soldiers conducted a series of human rights abuses against civilians and prisoners of war throughout East Asia and the Western Pacific region. These events reached their height during the Second Sino-Japanese War of 1937–45 and the Asian and Pacific campaigns of World War II, 1940–145. 26. International and Japanese law. Japanese troops burying living Chinese civilians. Japan signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Prisoners of War and the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Sick and Wounded. 27. But the Japanese government declined to ratify the POW Convention. In 1942, the Japanese government stated that it would abide by the terms of the Convention mutatis mutandis, changing what has to be changed. 28. The crimes committed also fall under other aspects of international and Japanese law. For example, many of the crimes committed by Japanese personnel during World War II broke Japanese military law and were subject to court-martial, as required by that law. 29. the empire also violated international agreements signed by Japan, including provisions of the Hague Conventions, 1899 and 1907, such as protections for prisoners of war and a ban on the use of chemical weapons. The 1930 Forced Labor Convention, which prohibited forced labor, the 1921 International Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Women and Children, which prohibited human trafficking, and other agreements, 3031. The Japanese government also signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, 1929, thereby rendering its actions in 1937-45 liable to charges of crimes against peace, 32, a charge that was introduced at the Tokyo trials to prosecute Class A war criminals. Class B war criminals were those found guilty of war crimes per se, and Class C war criminals were those guilty of crimes against humanity. The Japanese government also accepted the terms set by the Potsdam Declaration, 1945, after the end of the war, including the provision in Article 10 of punishment for all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners. Japanese law does not define those convicted in the post-1945 trials as criminals, despite the fact that Japan's governments have accepted the judgments made in the trials, and in the Treaty of San Francisco, 1952. Clarification needed. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had advocated the position that Japan accepted the Tokyo Tribunal and its judgments as a condition for ending the war, but that its verdicts have no relation to domestic law. According to Abe, those convicted of war crimes are not criminals under Japanese law, 33. Historical and geographical extent. Samurai warriors of the Choshu clan during the Boshin War period of the 1860s. Outside Japan, different societies use widely different timeframes when they define Japanese war crimes. Citation needed. For example, the annexation of Korea by Japan in 1910 was enforced by the Japanese military, and the Society of Dynasty Korea was switched to the political system of the Empire of Japan. Thus, North and South Korea both refer to Japanese war crimes as events which occurred during the period of Korea under Japanese rule, 34. By comparison, the Western Allies did not come into a military conflict with Japan until 1941, and North Americans, Australians, Southeast Asians, and Europeans may consider Japanese war crimes to be events that occurred from 1942 to 1945, 35. A small minority of people in every Asian and Pacific country invaded or occupied by Japan collaborated with the Japanese military, or even served in it, for a wide variety of reasons, such as economic hardship, coercion, or antipathy to other imperialist powers. 36. In addition to Japanese civil and military personnel, Chinese, including Manchus, Koreans, and Taiwanese who were forced to serve in the military of the Empire of Japan, were also found to have committed war crimes as part of the Japanese Imperial Army. 3730, 83940. Background. Japanese militarism, nationalism, imperialism, and racism. Main articles: Bushido, statism in Showa Japan, Japanese militarism, Japanese nationalism, eugenics in Japan, fascism in Asia section Japan, racism in Asia section Japan, and racism in Japan. Japanese illustration depicting the beheading of Chinese captives during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895. Militarism, nationalism, imperialism, and racism, especially during Japan's imperialist expansion, had great bearings on the conduct of the Japanese armed forces both before and during the Second World War. After the Meiji Restoration and the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, the emperor became the focus of military loyalty, nationalism, and racism. During the so-called Age of Imperialism, in the late 19th century, Japan followed the lead of other world powers by establishing a colonial empire an objective which it aggressively pursued. Unlike many other major powers, Japan never ratified the Geneva Convention of 1929, also known as the Convention Relative to the Treatment of Prisoners of War, Geneva 27, July 1929, which was the version of the Geneva Convention that covered the treatment of prisoners of war during World War II, 41. Nevertheless, Japan ratified the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which contained provisions regarding prisoners of war 42, and an imperial proclamation in 1894 stated that Japanese soldiers should make every effort to win the war without violating international laws. According to Japanese historian Yuki Tanaka, Japanese forces during the First Sino-Japanese War released 1,790 Chinese prisoners without harm, once they signed an agreement not to take up arms against Japan if they were released. 43. After the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. All of the 79,367 Russian prisoners who were held by the Japanese were released, and they were also paid for the labor which they performed for the Japanese, in accordance with the Hague Convention. 43. Similarly, the behavior of the Japanese military in World War I was at least as humane as that of other militaries which fought during the war. 26. With some German prisoners of the Japanese finding life in Japan, so agreeable that they stayed and settled in Japan after the war. 44–45. Two Japanese commanders, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, competing to see who could kill, with a sword, 100 people first. The headline reads, "Incredible record in the contest to decapitate 100 people. Mukai 106, 105 Noda. Both second lieutenants go into extra innings." As Japan continued its modernization in the early 20th century, her armed forces became convinced that success in battle would be assured if Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen had the spirit of Bushido. The result was that the Bushido code of behavior was inculcated into the Japanese soldier as part of his basic training. Each soldier was indoctrinated to accept that it was the greatest honor to die for the emperor, and it was cowardly to surrender to the enemy. Bushido therefore explains why the Japanese soldiers who were stationed in the NEI so mistreated POWs in their custody. Those who had surrendered to the Japanese, regardless of how courageously or honorably they had fought, merited nothing but contempt. They had forfeited all honor and literally deserved nothing. Consequently, when the Japanese murdered POWs by shooting, beheading, and drowning, these acts were excused since they involved the killing of men who had forfeited all rights to be treated with dignity or respect. While civilian internees were certainly in a different category from POWs, it is reasonable to think that there was a spillover effect from the tenets of Bushido. Fred Borch, Military Trials of War Criminals in the Netherlands East Indies, 1940–6, 1940–946. Propaganda depictions of the Japanese military as superior, and of others such as the Chinese or Koreans as cowards, pigs, rats, or mice, occurred in the use of woodcuts produced for wide consumption, which were intended to provide a cruel amusement. The Medelkessel woodcut cartoon collection donated to the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, Sweden, was the subject of a catalogued exhibition in 2011 and includes examples of this type of material from the Meiji period. 47. Events of the 1930s and 1940s. By the late 1930s, the rise of militarism in Japan created at least superficial similarities between the wider Japanese military culture and that of Germany. Japan also had a military secret police force within the IJA, known as the Kempeitai, which resembled the Nazi Gestapo in its role in annexed and occupied countries, but which had existed for nearly a decade before Hitler's own birth. 48. Perceived failure or insufficient devotion to the emperor would attract punishment, frequently of the physical kind. 49. In the military, Officers would assault and beat men under their command, who would pass the beating all the way down on to the lowest ranks. In POW camps, this meant that prisoners of war received the worst beatings of all, 50 partly in the belief that such punishments were merely the proper technique to deal with disobedience. 49. The phenomenon of Gekkokujo, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, which involves lower-ranking officers overthrowing or assassinating their superiors, as evidenced by the multiple coups and assassinations carried out on the mainland, also allowed for the proliferation of war crimes, because if commanders tried to restrict atrocities, they would either face mutiny or reassignment. Historians have also attributed war crimes to the lack of supervision and disorganization within the military, which without stronger control over units and effective court-martial procedures allowed for war crimes to go unpunished, and therefore continue. 51-52. Compared to the German Einsatzgruppen, which carried out mass shootings on the Eastern Front in Europe, and who suffered from psychological issues as a result, no such problems occurred with Japanese soldiers, as the vast majority of soldiers participated in murder and rape, and seemingly enjoyed it. 53. However, some sources have reported psychological issues and regret from Japanese soldiers participating in these massacres and war crimes, and that some may have deeply impacted as a result. 54. War crimes. An Australian POW, SGT, Leonard Syphillet, captured in New Guinea, about to be beheaded by a Japanese officer with a gunto, 1943. Much of the controversy regarding Japan's role in World War II revolves around the death rates of prisoners of war and civilians under Japanese occupation. Historian Sterling Seagrave has written that arriving at a probable number of Japan's war victims who died is difficult for several interesting reasons, which have to do with Western perceptions. Both Americans and Europeans fell into the unfortunate habit of seeing WW1 and WW2 as separate wars, failing to comprehend that they were interlaced in a multitude of ways, not merely that one was the consequence of the other, or of the rash behavior of the victors after WW1. Wholly aside from this basic misconception, most Americans think of WW2 in Asia as having begun with Pearl Harbor, the British with the fall of Singapore, and so forth. The Chinese would correct this by identifying the Marco Polo Bridge incident as the start, or the earlier Japanese seizure of Manchuria. It really began in 1895 with Japan's assassination of Korea's Queen Min, an invasion of Korea, resulting in its absorption into Japan, followed quickly by Japan's seizure of southern Manchuria, etc., establishing that Japan was at war from 1895 to 1945. Prior to 1895, Japan had only briefly invaded Korea during the shogunate, long before the Meiji Restoration, and the invasion failed. Therefore, Rummel's estimate of 6 million to 10 million dead between 1937, the rape of Nanjing, and 1945 may be roughly corollary to the time frame of the Nazi Holocaust, but it falls far short of the actual numbers killed by the Japanese war machine. If you add, say, 2 million Koreans, 2 million Manchurians, Chinese, Russians, many East European Jews, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi, and others killed by Japan between 1895 and 1937, conservative figures, the total of Japanese victims is more like 10 million to 14 million. Of these, I would suggest that between 6 million and 8 million were ethnic Chinese, regardless of where they were resident. 55. In 1943, Prince Mikasa, the younger brother of Hirohito and a member of the Imperial House of Japan, served as an officer in the Imperial Japanese Army stationed in China. 56. He authored a book published in 1984, in which he revealed his shock at the atrocities carried out by the Japanese military during his one-year deployment in China. 56. In 1994, the Japanese newspaper outlet Yomiuri Shimbun conducted an interview with him. 57. He provided an account of Japanese atrocities committed against the Chinese, and verified that he had denounced the aggression in a speech addressed to Japanese soldiers in China during World War II. 57. He discovered that military officers utilized Chinese prisoners of war for bayonet drills to bolster the resolve of Japanese soldiers. 57. Additionally, he noted that POWs were asphyxiated and shot in large numbers while being restrained to posts. 57. He emphasized that killing POWs in a gruesome manner constitutes a massacre, affirming without doubt that Japanese soldiers indeed committed such atrocious acts. 57. According to Werner Gruhl, approximately 8 million Chinese civilian deaths were attributable directly to Japanese aggression. 13. According to the findings of the Tokyo Tribunal, the death rate among prisoners of war from Asian countries held by Japan was 27.1%. 58. The death rate of Chinese prisoners of war were much higher because, under a directive ratified on 5 August 1937 by Emperor Hirohito, the constraints of international law on treatment of those prisoners was removed. 59. Only 56 Chinese prisoners of war were released after the surrender of Japan. 60. After 20 March 1943, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered and encouraged the Navy to execute all prisoners taken at sea. According to British historian Mark Felton, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the deliberately sadistic murders of more than 20,000 Allied seamen and countless civilians in cold-blooded defiance of the Geneva Convention. At least 12,500 British sailors and 7,500 Australians were murdered. The Japanese Navy sank Allied merchant and Red Cross vessels, then murdered the survivors floating in the sea or in lifeboats. During naval landing parties, the Japanese Navy rounded up, raped, then massacred civilians. Some of the victims were fed to sharks, others were killed by sledgehammer, bayonet, crucifixion, drowning, hanging, and beheading. 61-62. Attacks on neutral powers. Main article: Attack on Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona burning during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Article 1 of the 1907 Hague Convention III. The opening of hostilities prohibited the initiation of hostilities against neutral powers, without previous and explicit warning, in the form either of a reasoned declaration of war or of an ultimatum with conditional declaration of war. And Article 2 further stated that the existence of a state of war must be notified to the neutral powers without delay, and shall not take effect in regard to them until after the receipt of a notification, which may, however, be given by telegraph. Japanese diplomats intended to deliver the notice to the United States 30 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred on 7 December 1941, but it was delivered to the U.S. government an hour after the attack was over. Tokyo transmitted the 5,000-word notification, commonly called the 14-part message, in 2 blocks to the Japanese embassy in Washington, but transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it in time. 63. The 14-part message was not, moreover, a declaration of war, but was instead about sending a message to U.S. officials that peace negotiations between Japan and the U.S. were likely to be terminated. Japanese officials were well aware that the 14-part message was not a proper declaration of war as required by the 1907 Hague Convention III, the opening of hostilities. They decided not to issue a proper declaration of war anyway, as they feared that doing so would expose their secret attack on Pearl Harbor to the Americans. 64-65. Some historical negationists and conspiracy theorists charge that President Franklin D. Roosevelt willingly allowed the attack to happen to create a pretext for war, but no credible evidence exists to support the claim. 66-67-68. The diary of Henry L. Stimson, Roosevelt's Secretary of War, showed that Roosevelt believed in late November 1941 that a Japanese attack on British or Dutch soil was likely, but was confident that the Japanese would not dare to start hostilities against the United States. 69, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan declared war on the U.S., and the U.S. likewise declared war on Japan. Simultaneously with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, Honolulu time, Japan invaded the British colony of Malaya, bombed Singapore, and began land actions in Hong Kong without a declaration of war or an ultimatum. Both the United States and United Kingdom were neutral when Japan attacked their territories without explicit warning of a state of war. 70. The U.S. officially classified all 3,649 military and civilian casualties and destruction of military property at Pearl Harbor as non-combatants, as there was no state of war between the U.S. and Japan when the attack occurred. 71 failed verification 72 page, range 2 broad self-published source. Joseph B. Keenan, the chief prosecutor in the Tokyo trials, says that the attack on Pearl Harbor not only happened without a declaration of war, but was also a treacherous and deceitful act. In fact, Japan and the U.S. were still negotiating for a possible peace agreement, which kept U.S. officials distracted up to the point that Japanese planes launched their attack on Pearl Harbor. Keenan explained the definition of a war of aggression and the criminality of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The concept of aggressive war may not be expressed with the precision of a scientific formula or described like the objective data of the physical sciences. Aggressive war is not entirely a physical fact to be observed and defined like the operation of the laws of matter. It is rather an activity involving injustice between nations, rising to the level of criminality because of its disastrous effects upon the common good of international society. The injustice of a war of aggression is criminal of its extreme grosses, considered both from the point of view of the will of the aggressor to inflict injury and from the evil effects which ensue. Unjust war are plainly crimes, and not simply torts or breaches of contracts. The act comprises the willful, intentional, and unreasonable destruction of life, limb, and property, subject matter which has been regarded as criminal by the laws of all civilized peoples. The Pearl Harbor attack breached the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Hague Convention III. In addition, it violated Article 23 of the Annex to the Hague Convention IV of October 1907. But the attack of Pearl Harbor did not alone result in murder and the slaughter of thousands of human beings. It did not eventuate only in the destruction of property. It was an outright act of undermining and destroying the hope of a world for peace. When a nation employs a deceit and treachery, using periods of negotiations and the negotiations themselves as a cloak to screen a perfidious attack, then there is a prime example of the crime of all crimes. 73-74. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, was fully aware that if Japan lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal for that attack. Citation needed. As it turned out, he was killed by the USAAF in Operation Vengeance in 1943. At the Tokyo trials, Prime Minister Hideki Shigenori Togo, then Foreign Minister Shigetaro Shimada, the Minister of the Navy, and Asami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, were charged with crimes against peace, charges 1 to 36, and murder charges 37 to 52, in connection with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Along with war crimes and crimes against humanity, charges 53 to 55. Tojo was among the 7 Japanese leaders sentenced to death and executed by hanging in 1948. Shigenori Togo received a 20-year sentence, Shimada received a life sentence, and Nagano died of natural causes during the trial in 1947. 65-75. Over the years, many Japanese nationalists argued that the attack on Pearl Harbor was justified as an act of self-defense in response to the oil embargo imposed by the United States. Most historians and scholars agree that the oil embargo cannot be used as justification for using military force against a foreign nation, imposing the embargo, because there is a clear distinction between a perception of something being essential to the welfare of the nation-state and a threat sufficiently serious to warrant an act of force in response, which Japan had failed to consider. Japanese scholar and diplomat Takeo Iguchi states that it is hard to say from the perspective of international law that exercising the right of self-defense against economic pressures is considered valid. While Japan felt that its dreams of further expansion would be brought to a halt by the American embargo, this need cannot be considered proportional with the destruction suffered by the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, intended by Japanese military planners to be as devastating as possible. 65. Mass killings. Japanese soldiers shooting blindfolded Sikh prisoners and then bayoneting them. Photos discovered after the liberation of Singapore. Suzhou, China, 1938. A mass grave filled with bodies of Chinese civilians murdered by Japanese soldiers. 76. Photo taken in Suzhou, showing the body of a Chinese woman who was raped and killed by Japanese soldiers. The estimated number of people killed by Japanese troops varies. R.J. Rummel, a professor of political science at the University of Hawaii, estimates that between 1937 and 1945, the Japanese military murdered from nearly 3 to over 10 million people, most likely 6 million Chinese, Indians, Koreans, Malays, Indonesians, Filipinos, and Indochinese, among others, including European, American, and Australian prisoners of war. According to Rummel, this democide, i.e., death by government, was due to a morally bankrupt political and military strategy, military expediency and custom, and national culture. 77. According to Rummel, in China alone, from 1937 to 1945, approximately 3.9 million Chinese were killed, mostly civilians, as a direct result of the Japanese operations, and a total of 10.2 million Chinese were killed in the course of the war. 78. According to the British historian M.R.D. Foote, civilian deaths were between 10 million and 20 million. 79. British historian Mark Felton claims that up to 30 million people were killed, most of them civilians. 3. The Japanese murdered 30 million civilians while liberating what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere from colonial rule. About 23 million of these were ethnic Chinese. It is a crime that in sheer numbers is far greater than the Nazi Holocaust. In Germany, Holocaust denial is a crime. In Japan, it is government policy. But the evidence against the Navy, precious little of which you will find in Japan itself, is damning. 80-182. One of the major atrocities committed during this period was the Nanjing Massacre of 1937–38, when, according to the findings of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Japanese army massacred as many as 260,000 civilians and prisoners of war, though some who have placed the figure as high as 350,000. 83. The Memorial Hall of the Victims in Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders has the death figure of 300,000 inscribed on its entrance. 84. In the early 1980s, after conducting extensive interviews with Chinese survivors and reviewing existing Japanese records, Japanese journalist Honda Katsuichi concluded that the violence perpetrated by Japanese troops in the Nanjing Massacre was not an isolated event. Instead, it was part of a broader pattern of Japanese atrocities against the Chinese in the lower Yangtze region since the Battle of Shanghai. 85. Hisaka Akira was an army physician, and his infantry battalion was stationed in China. In his diary, he admitted to following an order to murder civilians in the Chinese city of Changzhou. 85. Hisaka's diary documenting the Japanese atrocities in Changzhou has been supported by various Japanese sources. In 1987, his squad leader, Kitayama, confessed to killing civilians in Changju. 86. Makihara Nobuo was part of an infantry platoon that entered a Chinese town. In Makihara's diary, he recorded that his machine gun company followed orders to indiscriminately kill all civilians in the town. 85. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese followed what has been called a killing policy, including killings committed against minorities such as Hui Muslims in China. According to Wan Lei, in a Hui-clustered village in Gaocheng County of Hebei, the Japanese captured 20 Hui men, among whom they only set 2 younger men free through redemption, and buried alive the other 18 Hui men. In Menkun village of Hebei, the Japanese killed more than 1,300 Hui people within 3 years of their occupation of that area. The Japanese also desecrated and destroyed mosques and destroyed Hui cemeteries. After the Nanjing massacre, mosques in Nanjing were found filled with dead bodies. 87. Many Hui Muslims in the Second Sino-Japanese War fought against the Japanese military. Citation needed. In addition, the Hui Muslim county of Dacheng was subjected to massacres by the Japanese military. 88. Citizens of Manila run for safety from suburbs burned by Japanese soldiers. 10. February 1945. Photo of a Filipino woman and child killed by Japanese forces in Manila. Another massacre during this period was the Parrot Sulong massacre in Japanese-occupied Malaya, when, according to the findings of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Imperial Japanese Army massacred approximately 500 prisoners of war, although higher estimates exist. Citation needed. A similar crime committed was the Changjiao massacre in China. Back in Southeast Asia, the Laha massacre resulted in the deaths of 705 prisoners of war on Japanese-occupied Indonesia's Ambon Island, and in Japanese-occupied Singapore's Alexandra Hospital massacre, Japanese soldiers murdered hundreds of wounded Allied soldiers, innocent citizens, and medical staff. Citation needed.